My name is Iva, and at 53 I thought I knew my son better than anyone else in this world. But as I sat in my car outside Marcus's house that evening, staring at the warm glow spilling from his dining room windows, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. 2 weeks had passed since our explosive argument about his inheritance request, and now, out of nowhere, he had invited me to a family dinner. The same son who had stormed out of my house calling me selfish was suddenly extending an olive branch. I wanted to believe this was about reconciliation, about healing the rift between us. But something in his voice during that phone call, something too careful, too practiced, made me wonder if I was walking into something far more calculated than a simple family meal. Before we dive into this story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Now let me tell you about the dinner that changed everything I thought I knew about my own child. To understand what happened that night, you need to know the history Marcus and I share. He came into this world during one of the happiest periods of my life. His father, David, was my college sweetheart, and we had built what felt like the perfect little family in our suburban home in Ohio. Marcus was our miracle baby after 3 years of trying, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he became the center of our universe. David was an electrician who worked long hours, but always made time for Marcus. Saturday mornings were their special time together, working on little projects in the garage or throwing a football in the backyard. I worked part-time as a dental hygienist, which gave me the flexibility to be home when Marcus got out of school. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable, and more importantly, we were happy. Everything changed when Marcus turned 12. David was working on a commercial building downtown when the scaffolding collapsed. The doctor said he died instantly, which was supposed to be some kind of comfort, but all I felt was the earth opening up beneath my feet. Suddenly, I was a single mother, with a mortgage, a grieving son, and no idea how I was going to keep our world from completely falling apart. Those first few years after David's death were the hardest of my life. I took on a second job at a medical office doing billing, and weekends I cleaned houses for extra income. Marcus threw himself into sports and academics, perhaps as a way of coping with his father's absence. Or maybe because he sensed how hard I was working to provide for him. He was a good kid, respectful and responsible, though I sometimes caught glimpses of an entitlement that worried me. When college time came around, Marcus had his heart set on a private university that cost more per year than I made at both my jobs combined. But I had been saving every penny I could, and I took out additional loans to make his dream possible. He studied business and marketing, graduating with honors, and I felt such pride watching him walk across that stage. David would have been so proud, too. Marcus met Diana during his senior year, and they married 2 years later. Diana was beautiful and ambitious, working in real estate, and they seemed perfectly matched. When their first child, Emma, was born, I felt like I was getting a second chance at the family happiness that had been cut short when David died. Tyler followed 2 years later, and suddenly, I was not just Iva anymore, but Grandma Iva, a role that filled my heart in ways I had not expected. But somewhere along the way, the gratitude I had seen in Marcus as a young man began to fade. It started small, offhand comments about how lucky other families were, how easy some people had it financially. When he and Diana bought their first house, they needed help with the down payment. When Diana's real estate business hit a rough patch, they needed help with credit card debt. When the kids needed private school tuition, they came to me again. I helped every time because that is what mothers do. But with each request, I noticed Marcus becoming more comfortable asking and less grateful when I said yes. The please and thank yous became less frequent, replaced by explanations of why they deserved my help, why it was really an investment in the family's future. Diana, who had been sweet and deferential in the early years of their marriage, began to speak to me with a familiarity that sometimes bordered on presumption. Still, they were my family, my only family, and I convinced myself that this was just how modern families worked. Young couples needed more help getting started than my generation had, and I was fortunate to be in a position to provide it. The warning signs were there, but I chose to interpret them as growing pains rather than something more troubling. The confrontation that led to that dinner invitation happened on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Marcus had called the day before asking if he and Diana could come by with the kids for a visit. Nothing unusual about that. We tried to get together every few weeks, and I always enjoyed having my grandchildren around. I made Emma's favorite cookies and bought Tyler the superhero action figure he had been wanting. The visit started normally enough. Diana helped me set out snacks while Marcus played video games with Tyler. Emma and I worked on a puzzle at the kitchen table, her little fingers carefully placing pieces while she chattered about school and friends. For a moment, everything felt right with the world the way family gatherings should feel. After dinner, Marcus suggested the kids go play in the backyard while the adults talked. That was when the atmosphere in the room shifted. Diana suddenly became very interested in her phone, while Marcus cleared his throat in that way people do when they are about to bring up something important. I had heard that throat clearing many times over the years, and it never preceded good news. Marcus started by telling me how grateful he and Diana were for all the support I had given them over the years. He acknowledged that I had been more generous than any mother should have to be helping them through various financial challenges. His words were warm and appreciative, and for a moment, I felt that familiar maternal pride, thinking how mature and thoughtful my son had become. Then came the pivot. Marcus explained that he had been offered an incredible business opportunity, a chance to start his own marketing consultancy with a former colleague. The potential was enormous, he said, but it required significant startup capital. Traditional business loans were difficult to get in the current economic climate, and banks were not lending to new ventures the way they used to. That was when he asked for $300,000 as an advance on his inheritance. Not a loan, he was careful to clarify, but an early distribution of what would eventually come to him anyway. He had clearly thought through this presentation, explaining how the business would provide security for Diana and the children, how it would actually increase the value of my estate in the long run, since he would be paying me back with interest. Diana finally looked up from her phone to add that they had already found office space and had potential clients lined up. This was not some pipe dream, she insisted, but a solid business plan that just needed the right funding to get off the ground. She pulled out a folder with what looked like professional document spreadsheets and projections that they had obviously spent considerable time preparing. The problem was not with their presentation, which was polished and persuasive. The problem was with the numbers. I had worked for over 30 years living frugally and saving diligently, but $300,000 represented more than half of everything I had managed to accumulate. My retirement savings totaled just over $500,000 money that was supposed to last me for the rest of my life. I tried to explain this gently at first. I told them I was proud of Marcus's ambition and that the business opportunity sounded promising, but that I simply could not afford to give away such a large portion of my retirement savings. I was 53 years old, working 2 jobs, and still years away from being able to retire myself. That money was not just sitting around waiting to be inherited, it was my security blanket for the future. Marcus's reaction was swift and harsh. His face flushed red as he accused me of being selfish and short-sighted. He said I was living like a miser, hoarding money I would never be able to spend instead of investing in my family's future. Diana joined in pointing out how much they had sacrificed over the years, how they could have moved somewhere with better career opportunities, but had stayed close to me instead. The argument escalated quickly from there. Marcus brought up every financial assistance I had ever provided, reframing each act of generosity as evidence that I had more money than I needed. He accused me of playing favorites, of loving my money more than my own grandchildren. When I tried to explain that helping with a down payment was different from giving away my entire nest egg, he called me a hypocrite. Diana's contribution to the fight was particularly painful. She suggested that I was being paranoid about my financial security, that family was supposed to take care of family, and that my reluctance to help showed a fundamental selfishness that surprised her. She said she had always thought I was more generous than this, but now she was seeing my true colors. The evening ended with Marcus storming out, telling me I was going to end up a lonely old woman who died with a bank account full of money and no one who cared about her. Diana gathered the children and followed him out without saying goodbye, leaving me standing in my living room surrounded by the debris of what had felt like a normal family visit just hours before. For 2 weeks after that fight, my phone was silent. No calls from Marcus, no texts from Diana, no visits from the grandchildren, who had been such a regular part of my weekly routine. I told myself they just needed time to cool down, that Marcus would eventually see my side of things, and we would work through this like families do. But as the days passed, the silence began to feel more ominous than angry. That was why Marcus's call inviting me to dinner felt so significant. When I heard his voice on the other end of the line, tentative but warm, my heart leaped with relief. He apologized for how heated things had gotten during our last conversation and said he had been doing some thinking. He and Diana wanted to cook dinner for me, just family time, with no agenda, no business talk, just a chance to reconnect and move forward. I arrived at their house 15 minutes early, having spent far too long deciding what to wear and whether to bring flowers or wine. I settled on a bottle of the red wine Diana had mentioned liking, and a small gift bag of treats for the children. Standing on their front porch, I took a deep breath and reminded myself to let bygones be bygones, to focus on rebuilding rather than relitigating old grievances. Diana answered the door wearing a smile that seemed carefully constructed. She hugged me and complimented my outfit, but something felt rehearsed about her warmth. When I handed her the wine, she thanked me effusively, almost too enthusiastically, the way people do when they are trying very hard to seem natural. Marcus appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron that made him look domestic and approachable. He gave me a big hug and told me how happy he was that I had come, how much he had missed our family dinners. But even as he said the words, I noticed his eyes did not quite meet mine, and his smile seemed to require effort. The children's behavior struck me as the most unusual thing about the evening. Emma and Tyler, who normally ran to greet me with enthusiasm, offering to show me their latest artwork or school projects, seemed subdued and formal. They hugged me when prompted by their parents, but then retreated to the couch, where they sat unusually quietly, occasionally glancing at their parents, as if waiting for cues. Diana had clearly put considerable effort into the meal. She had prepared herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables and wild rice pilaf foods she knew I enjoyed. The table was set with their wedding china candles flickered in crystal holders and soft jazz played in the background. Everything was perfect, perhaps too perfect for what was supposed to be a casual family dinner. Throughout the meal, the conversation felt stilted and artificial. Marcus asked about my work with genuine seeming interest, but his questions felt scripted. Diana complimented my hair and asked about my book club, but her attention seemed divided as if she was thinking about something else entirely. Even the children participated in the conversation in ways that seemed coached, asking me polite questions about my hobbies and weekend plans. About halfway through dinner, Marcus began steering the conversation toward their financial situation, but in what seemed like an organic way. He mentioned how challenging the current job market was, how many of his colleagues were struggling to find stable employment. Diana added comments about the rising cost of everything from groceries to children's activities, shaking her head sympathetically, as if these were just general observations about modern life. When Marcus mentioned that he had been having some career uncertainties lately, my maternal instincts kicked in, and I asked if everything was okay. That was when he began to share what seemed like troubling news about his job security. His company was going through restructuring, he said, and several people in his department had already been let go. He was trying to stay positive, but the writing was on the wall. Diana nodded solemnly as Marcus spoke, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand in a gesture of support. She added that they were trying to prepare for the possibility that he might be out of work for a while, cutting back on expenses and looking into other options. But with the mortgage and the kids' schools, they were walking a financial tightrope. As I listened to them describe their situation, I felt my earlier suspicions beginning to dissolve. These were not people trying to manipulate me, but a young family facing real challenges and trying to handle them with dignity. When Marcus mentioned that they had been too proud to ask for help again so soon after our last conversation, I began to feel guilty about my earlier doubts. But something nagged at me throughout this revelation. Marcus was describing financial pressures and job insecurity, but their house showed no signs of a family tightening their belt. The expensive wine they served with dinner, Diana's new jewelry that I had noticed when she hugged me, the latest gaming system I had glimpsed in the living room. None of these suggested people who were cutting back on expenses. More troubling was the way Emma and Tyler reacted to their father's description of their financial difficulties. Rather than seeming worried or curious about what this might mean for their family, they appeared bored, as if they had heard this story many times before. Tyler even rolled his eyes slightly when Marcus mentioned the possibility of having to change schools, a gesture that seemed inappropriate for a child genuinely concerned about his future. By the time Diana served dessert, my earlier relief at reconciling with my family had transformed into a growing unease. This dinner felt less like a genuine attempt at reconciliation and more like an elaborate production with everyone playing roles they had rehearsed. When Marcus suggested we move to the living room for coffee and more comfortable conversation, I agreed, but with a sense of dread about what was coming next. The living room conversation began innocuously enough, with Marcus and Diana settling onto the sofa while I took the armchair across from them. The children had been dismissed to their rooms, ostensibly to do homework, but I noticed they lingered near the staircase, clearly instructed to stay within earshot. Diana poured coffee from their good china service, and Marcus asked if I was comfortable if I needed anything, fussing over me in a way that felt both touching and suspicious. Marcus began what seemed like a heartfelt confession about the stress he had been under lately. He apologized again for losing his temper during our last conversation, acknowledging that he had said things he did not mean in the heat of the moment. He looked genuinely remorseful as he explained how the pressure of providing for his family had been weighing on him, making him act in ways that were unlike his normal character. Diana supported his narrative, beautifully describing how she had watched her husband struggle with worry about their future. She painted a picture of a man who stayed awake at night, calculating bills and researching job opportunities, who had lost weight from stress and had started having anxiety attacks about their financial security. Her performance was compelling and sympathetic, designed to evoke my maternal protective instincts. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Marcus took a deep breath and admitted that he had not been entirely honest with me about their situation. He had not just been facing the possibility of losing his job, he had actually been laid off 3 months earlier. He had been too ashamed and embarrassed to tell me, hoping he would find new employment quickly, and I would never need to know about this difficult period in their lives. The admission seemed to open floodgates of honesty. Diana explained how they had been living off their savings and her real estate commissions, but the money was running out faster than they had anticipated. They had already borrowed against Marcus's retirement account and had taken advances on Diana's future commissions. They were facing the very real possibility of losing their home if Marcus did not find work soon, or if they could not find another source of income. Marcus's eyes filled with tears as he described the humiliation of being unemployed at 32, of feeling like he was failing as a provider for his family. He talked about the rejections from potential employers, the interviews that seemed promising but led nowhere, the growing desperation as their financial cushion disappeared. This was not the confident, sometimes entitled son I had been dealing with for years, but a vulnerable man who seemed genuinely frightened about his family's future. Diana brought out documents to support their story. bank statements showing depleted savings accounts, mortgage statements with late payment notices, credit card bills that had grown to alarming levels. She had organized everything in a folder presenting their financial crisis with the thoroughness of someone who had been living with these numbers every day for months. When Marcus finally asked for help again, it was with a humility I had not heard from him since he was a child. He was not asking for money to start a business anymore, but for help keeping his family in their home. The $300,000 he had requested before was now framed not as an investment opportunity, but as a lifeline for his children, a way to keep Emma and Tyler from having their lives turned upside down by foreclosure and financial ruin. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and multi-layered. Diana brought the children back downstairs, and Emma began crying as Marcus explained that they might have to move away from their friends and schools. Tyler, trying to be brave, asked if they would still be able to have Christmas presents this year, a question that was clearly designed to break my heart. Diana comforted them while shooting meaningful looks at me, her expression conveying both desperation and expectation. Marcus then delivered what seemed like his final card. He told me that they had explored every other option, had swallowed their pride, and asked Diana's parents for help. But her family was dealing with their own financial challenges and could not provide the assistance they needed. I was their last hope. He said the only person in the world who could save his children from losing their home and having their lives destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. The pressure in the room became almost unbearable. Diana was crying silently while holding Emma, who was sobbing about not wanting to leave her school. Tyler sat beside his father, with tears in his eyes, looking between Marcus and me, as if trying to understand why his grandmother would not help save their family. Marcus looked defeated and broke in a far cry from the angry young man who had stormed out of my house 2 weeks earlier. When I asked for time to think about their request, to process everything they had told me, and consider how I might be able to help, Marcus's demeanor shifted slightly. He pressed for a more immediate response, explaining that they had only days before the foreclosure proceedings would begin, that waiting even until the end of the week might be too late. Diana added that they had already found temporary housing with friends, but it was not a long-term solution and would be traumatic for the children. But something about the urgency felt manufactured, and I began to notice inconsistencies in their story. The bank statements Diana had shown me were dated from several months ago, not recent enough to reflect their current crisis. Marcus mentioned being laid off 3 months earlier, but I remembered Diana posting photos on social media just last month of a family vacation to a resort in Florida. Most telling was the way the children responded to the conversation, with a rehearsed quality that suggested they had been coached on what to say and when to cry. I told them I needed to use the bathroom to compose myself and think about everything they had shared with me. As I walked down the hallway toward the guest bathroom, I could hear Marcus and Diana beginning to speak in low, urgent tones, but I could not make out their words. What I discovered when I reached the bathroom, however, would change everything about how I understood this evening and my relationship with my son. Standing in their hallway, I realized I could hear Marcus and Diana's conversation clearly through the thin walls of their house. What I heard made my blood run cold. They were not comforting each other about their dire financial situation or discussing how to handle my response to their request. Instead, they were conducting what sounded like a strategic debriefing of their performance. Marcus was saying that I seemed to be wavering, that the children's involvement had been effective, but that they might need to increase the pressure. Diana responded that my body language suggested I was still resistant, and they should have emphasized more strongly how this would benefit me in the long run, framing it as an investment rather than a gift. They were discussing me like I was a mark in a confidence game, analyzing my reactions and planning their next moves. Diana mentioned that her research had indicated older adults were most vulnerable to family manipulation when they feared losing access to grandchildren. She suggested they should emphasize more strongly how my refusal to help would damage my relationship with Emma and Tyler, how the children would grow up knowing their grandmother had chosen money over family loyalty. Marcus agreed, adding that they should probably bring up my age and the fact that I was unlikely to need such a large nest egg for very long anyway. The callousness of their conversation was breathtaking. But what horrified me most was the casual way they discussed using my grandchildren as weapons against me. Diana mentioned that Emma had been asking questions about why she needed to cry on cue, and they would need to come up with a better explanation for her role in their plan. Marcus suggested they tell her it was like acting in a school play, that sometimes adults needed help understanding how important family was. I also heard them discussing contingency plans if their current approach did not work. Marcus mentioned that they had been researching elder financial abuse laws, not to protect elderly relatives, but to understand how far they could push before their behavior might be considered legally problematic. Diana had apparently spoken to a lawyer friend about how adult children could gain access to elderly parents' assets in cases of diminished capacity information. That made me realize the stakes of this evening were higher than I had imagined. When I heard Diana say she had found paperwork about power of attorney documents in her purse, and they should consider asking me to sign them tonight while I was emotional and off balance, I knew I needed to act quickly. They were not just asking for money, they were potentially planning to gain legal control over my finances. The loving family dinner was actually a sophisticated attempt to manipulate me into signing away my financial independence. I quietly retreated to the bathroom and locked the door, my hands shaking as I processed what I had discovered. These were not my desperate children asking for help in a time of crisis, but calculating adults who had orchestrated an elaborate deception designed to separate me from my life savings. Everything about the evening, from Diana's careful meal planning to the children's coached performances, had been designed to create maximum emotional impact while minimizing my ability to think clearly about their request. Looking through the bathroom window, I could see Marcus's car in the driveway, the same expensive vehicle that someone facing foreclosure probably could not afford to keep. In the medicine cabinet mirror, I could see Diana's extensive collection of high-end cosmetics and skincare products items that suggested a lifestyle inconsistent with the financial desperation they had described. Even their house, which I had helped them buy, showed no signs of people preparing to lose everything. I pulled out my phone and began taking photos of everything I could see evidence that their claims of financial hardship were inconsistent with their actual living situation. I also started the voice recording app, hoping to capture more of their planning session when I returned to the living room. If they were going to treat this like a business transaction, I needed to protect myself like someone dealing with untrustworthy business partners. The person who walked back into that living room was not the same woman who had entered it 30 minutes earlier. I had arrived hoping to reconcile with my son and daughter-in-law, ready to consider helping them through what seemed like a genuine crisis. But I was returning with the knowledge that my own family had spent months planning an elaborate fraud designed to manipulate me out of my life savings, potentially setting me up for years of financial control and emotional abuse. When I sat back down in my chair, Marcus and Diana immediately resumed their roles as desperate parents facing an impossible situation. But now I could see the calculation behind Diana's tears and the practiced nature of Marcus's humility. When Emma and Tyler returned to the room to continue their part in the performance, I felt sick knowing these children were being taught to manipulate their grandmother for money. The time had come to confront them with what I knew, but I realized I needed to be strategic about it. If they were willing to go to these lengths to get my money, I had no idea how they might react to being exposed. I needed to maintain control of the situation while gathering as much evidence as possible of their deception. I settled back into my chair and looked around the room at my family with new eyes. Marcus immediately resumed his presentation, explaining that they had been hoping I would consider their request carefully and that time really was running short for them to avoid losing their home. Diana added that they understood this was a big decision for me, but that they hoped I could see how much this would mean to them and to the children's future. I nodded thoughtfully, and told them that I was moved by everything they had shared with me, that I could see how much they were struggling and how frightened they were about their future. Marcus's face lit up with hope, and Diana reached over to squeeze my hand in gratitude. Even the children seemed to relax slightly, as if they sensed their performance had been successful. Then I told them I wanted to help, but that I needed to see some documentation before I could make such a significant financial commitment. As someone who had worked in medical billing for years, I explained I had learned the importance of having proper paperwork for any major financial transaction. I would need to see current bank statements, the foreclosure notices they had mentioned, and Marcus's termination letter from his employer. Marcus and Diana exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. Diana was the first to respond, saying of course they understood my need for documentation, but that most of the paperwork was at their accountant's office. Marcus added that his termination had been handled verbally by his supervisor, so there might not be an official letter, and that the foreclosure process was still in preliminary stages, so they might not have received formal notices yet. I pressed gently for more specifics. Surely they had received some kind of written notice about Marcus's employment ending for unemployment benefits, if nothing else. And banks were required to provide written notice before beginning foreclosure proceedings, so there should be something official documenting the timeline they were facing. I maintained a concerned, helpful tone, while asking for the kind of basic documentation any reasonable person would want to see. The more I asked for evidence of their crisis, the more uncomfortable Marcus and Diana became. Diana mentioned that she kept most of their financial documents in a safety deposit box at the bank, which they could not access until morning. Marcus suggested that we could handle the documentation after I committed to helping them, since time was so critical, and paperwork could always be sorted out later. That was when I decided to reveal what I knew. I told them calmly that I had heard their conversation while I was in the bathroom, that I knew this entire evening had been a calculated attempt to manipulate me into giving them money. I explained that I had listened to them discuss my vulnerabilities and planned their strategy for applying emotional pressure, treating me like a target rather than a family member. Marcus immediately went into damage control mode, denying that I could have heard anything incriminating and suggesting that I had misunderstood whatever conversation I might have overheard. He claimed they had been discussing how to explain their situation more clearly, how to help me understand the seriousness of their problems without making me feel pressured or guilty. Diana took a different approach, becoming tearful and accusing me of looking for excuses not to help them. She said that even if they had discussed strategy for talking to me, that did not change the fact that they were facing real problems and needed real help. She suggested that my suspicion and mistrust were hurtful and that I was using minor inconsistencies to avoid helping my own family. I pulled out my phone and played back the recording I had made of their conversation. Their voices filled the room, discussing how to manipulate me more effectively, how to use my grandchildren against me, and how to research legal ways to gain control over my finances. The sound of their own words, cold and calculating, seemed to shock even them. Marcus tried to explain away the recording, saying that people often sounded worse when taken out of context, that they had been stressed and not thinking clearly about how their words might sound. But Diana's reaction was more revealing. She became angry rather than apologetic, demanding to know how I dared to record private conversations in their home, accusing me of being paranoid and manipulative myself. The children who had been listening to this exchange with growing confusion and alarm began to understand that the family crisis they had been asked to help with might not be real. Emma asked her mother why she had told her to cry about moving away from school if they were not really going to move. Tyler wanted to know if his father really had lost his job or if that was pretend too. Diana snapped at the children to go to their rooms, her careful maternal facade completely dissolving under pressure. But the damage was done. Emma was crying real tears now, not the performance tears from earlier, confused and frightened by the realization that her parents had been using her in some kind of grown-up deception. Tyler looked angry and betrayed, old enough to understand that he had been manipulated into lying to his grandmother. That was when Diana made her biggest mistake. instead of continuing to deny or deflect her anger, got the better of her, and she began telling me what she really thought. She said that I was a selfish old woman who was sitting on money I would never need while my own family struggled. She accused me of enjoying the power that comes with controlling family finances, of using my wealth to manipulate my adult children into staying close to me. Marcus tried to stop her, sensing that she was destroying any remaining chance of getting what they wanted. But Diana was beyond caring about strategy. She told me that they deserved my money more than I did, that they were young and could put it to good use, while I would probably just leave it sitting in bank accounts earning minimal interest. She said that family was supposed to support family, and my refusal to help showed that I cared more about money than I did about my own grandchildren's welfare. The mask was completely off now, and I was seeing the real Diana for the first time. This was not a woman facing a financial crisis, but someone who felt entitled to my money and angry that I was not handing it over willingly. Her sense of entitlement was breathtaking, her assumption that my life's savings somehow belonged to her and Marcus simply because we were related. I stood up calmly and told them that I would be changing my will immediately, setting up a trust fund for Emma and Tyler that they would receive when they turned 25, but that Marcus and Diana would not be receiving any inheritance from me. I explained that I had seen enough of their character to know that giving them control over significant amounts of money would only enable more manipulation and deception. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice desperate now that he realized their plan had completely backfired. He begged me not to punish Diana for being upset, claiming that the stress of their situation had made her say things she did not mean. He promised that if I would just help them this one time, they would never ask for money again, that they would prove themselves worthy of my trust and generosity. But I had heard and seen too much to believe any more promises from either of them. I gathered my purse and coat and told them I would be leaving, now that they should not contact me unless they were ready to offer a genuine apology and demonstrate real change in their attitudes and behavior. As I walked toward the door, Diana called after me that I would regret this decision, that I was destroying my relationship with my grandchildren over money. I turned back one last time and told her that she and Marcus had destroyed our family relationships the moment they decided to treat me like a mark in a confidence game rather than like someone who loved them. The children were watching from the stairway, and I told them that I loved them very much, but that their parents needed to learn some important lessons about honesty and respect before we could all be a family again. 6 months have passed since that terrible dinner, and I can honestly say that walking out of Marcus's house that night was one of the most difficult and liberating things I have ever done. The first few weeks were brutal, filled with doubt, and second-guessing myself about whether I had been too harsh, too suspicious, too quick to assume the worst about my son and daughter-in-law. Marcus called several times in the days following our confrontation, alternating between apologies and accusations. Sometimes he would admit that they had handled things badly and beg for another chance to make things right. Other times, he would claim that I had blown everything out of proportion, that families should be able to discuss financial needs without being accused of manipulation and fraud. Diana never called to apologize, but she did send several text messages explaining why I had been wrong to distrust them. The silence that followed was painful but necessary. For the first time in years, I was not worried about the next request for money, not walking on eggshells to avoid conflict with my adult son, not making excuses for behavior that I knew was inappropriate. Instead, I was forced to confront the reality that the family dynamics I had been accepting were actually deeply unhealthy. I started attending a support group for older adults who had experienced financial abuse from family members, and I was shocked to discover how common my story was. The group leader explained that adult children manipulating elderly parents for money was one of the fastest-growing forms of elder abuse in the country, and that the tactics Marcus and Diana had used were textbook examples of financial manipulation. Through the support group, I met other women who had been through similar experiences. There was Margaret, whose son had convinced her to co-sign loans he never intended to pay back. There was Patricia, whose daughter had gained power of attorney and systematically emptied her mother's savings account. There was Susan, whose family had used her grandchildren as emotional weapons to extract money for various crises that turned out to be fabricated. Hearing their stories helped me understand that what had happened to me was not a reflection of my failure as a mother, but a form of abuse that can happen to any loving parent who has assets that adult children want to access. The group taught me about setting boundaries, recognizing manipulation tactics, and protecting myself financially without cutting off the possibility of genuine reconciliation in the future. I also started volunteering at a local organization that helps single mothers develop financial literacy and job skills. Working with young women who were struggling to provide for their children while building better futures reminded me why financial independence was so important and why protecting my savings was not selfish but necessary for maintaining my autonomy as I aged. The trust fund I established for Emma and Tyler is managed by an independent financial institution with clear guidelines about how the money can be used for their education and future needs. They will receive statements annually showing how their funds are growing, and they will have access to the money when they turn 25, regardless of their parents' financial situation or relationship with me. Marcus did attempt to reconnect a few more times, usually when he needed money for some new crisis. But each time, his approach was the same emotional manipulation pressure tactics and an underlying assumption that I owed him financial support. He never acknowledged the deeper issues that had led to our estrangement, never showed genuine understanding of why their behavior had been so hurtful and destructive. I have learned to distinguish between genuine love and conditional affection, between family loyalty and family exploitation. The son who loved me would never have orchestrated such an elaborate deception, would never have used my grandchildren as props in a financial con game, would never have researched ways to gain legal control over my assets without my knowledge. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that saying no to unreasonable demands is not an act of selfishness, but an act of self-preservation. For too many years, I had confused enabling with generosity, had mistaken being used for being needed. Learning to protect my boundaries has actually made me more generous with people who approach me honestly and treat me with genuine respect. I still miss my grandchildren terribly, and I hope that someday they will seek me out independently when they are old enough to understand what really happened during this period of our family's history. But I have learned that sacrificing my financial security and emotional well-being would not have actually helped them in the long run, would only have taught them that manipulation and deception are acceptable ways to get what you want from people who love you. The money I refused to give Marcus is still sitting in my retirement accounts, growing steadily and providing me with the security I need to age with dignity and independence. More importantly, I have learned to value my own well-being enough to protect it even from family members who would exploit my love for their financial gain. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when that refusal comes at great personal cost. Today, I am not the same woman who sat in her car outside her son's house 6 months ago, hoping for reconciliation while dreading manipulation. I am someone who has learned the difference between family loyalty and family exploitation. Someone who understands that genuine love never requires you to sacrifice your own security for someone else's convenience. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family members made you question whether you were being generous or being taken advantage of? I would love to hear about your experiences with setting boundaries with people you love. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about navigating difficult family relationships. Share this with someone who might need to hear that it is okay to say no to unreasonable demands, even from family. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that protecting yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. May you find the courage to set boundaries that preserve both your love and your well-being.